Hi, students of Paul. Welcome to this very short session on words I want you to think twice about in this class about Paul. And the reason is that our words say something about what we think, and what we think translates into the words that we use. And so these are words I want you to think twice about and that I have changed my thought about over time in studying Paul. So terms change their meaning over time. And if we don't realize that, we're missing one of the most basic facts about history, and that is that the word might be the same, but the concept can change drastically. So just a small example, and a fairly recent one, the term knight. I always thought about the image that you see on the left, a knight being a person in armor with a sword and a shield. But in the 20th and 21st century, a knight can be far more often, and is far more often, someone like Sir Elton John, who may be wonderful with the piano, but I'm not sure how he would be with a sword and a shield. And that's only one example of the many, many terms that change. And why is that important? It's important when we talk about Paul and when we talk about early Jesus following groups and when we talk about Judaism. So one of the first words that we have to pay attention to in this class is the term Christian. In fact, when we're in the first century and into the second in many cases, we should be really careful about using the term Christian. Not Christian, but non-Jewish Jesus follower or apostolic Jew or some other term. There was no Christianity, at least until the middle of the 100s, that is the mid-2nd century. One of the first references we get to Christian is the person Ignatius, who was amongst the first to use the term. Paul was definitely not a Christian. So we can't say Paul was a Christian. He wasn't. He was a Jew. There was no Christianity yet, pure and simple. And so that's practically one of the first reasons we can say that. But also, even if there had been a Christianity, Paul was a Jew. There were many forms of Judaism then, as there are now. Paul was wound up being a Jesus-following Jew. And some authors, Runeson and Nanos, proposed the term apostolic Jew for Paul. To think of Paul as a Christian in the modern sense is to misunderstand him and his first century context completely. So really be careful when you use the term Christian about anything in the first century. Even Paul's non-Jewish Jesus followers were really not Christians. Those might be the ones who would be closest to something you could call a Christian, but they're not really Christians in today's sense. And that is because Christianity didn't exist yet. So even those non-Jewish Jesus followers whom Paul wrote to in his letters were followers, non-Jewish followers of a Jewish messianic movement. The very first use of the term Christian, Christianoi, was actually an insult leveled at these Jesus following groups by others. So be very careful with that word Christian and think about that when you use that ever in terms of Paul, especially. Related to that is and very much following from it, is the idea that Paul was converted. Paul never converted to Christianity. Again, there was no Christianity to convert to. It did not exist as a separate religion. That's probably the main thing. But even if it had, Paul remained his whole life a Torah-observant Jew. But the term conversion tends to imply two distinct and well-formed religions. So a person converts to Islam from Christianity, or converts to Buddhism from Judaism, or something like that in our day. But in Paul's day, there was no separate Jesus movement called Christianity that Paul could convert to. In fact, when Paul refers to his radical life change, and it was a radical life change, nobody ever denies that, and Paul certainly says that about himself. When Paul refers to that radical life change that comes about from his report of his meeting with the resurrected Christ, he uses language much more reminiscent of a Hebrew prophet's call. And in fact, he almost picks up the terms of Jeremiah and says, the God of Israel called him when he was still in his mother's womb, and he was called in that way. So it's much more of a prophetic language. Paul was not converted. He was called. Did he go through a radical life change? Absolutely. In fact, in the first century, it's not just about Paul. Since one's religion was tied to one's place of birth and one's people, there was no conversion, period. It wasn't just that Paul didn't convert. No one did, or almost no one. You could convert perhaps if you, in the case of marriage sometimes, or of a move or something like that. But in most cases, you could no more change your religion than you could say that you were born in a different place from where you were born, because your religion went along with your city or your area, and with the people of that area. If you were a Scythian, you had a Scythian god. If you were Egyptian, you had an Egyptian god, and so on. If you were from Ephesus, you had Artemis. And so you really couldn't change these things, which is part of what makes what happened to Paul's Christ-following non-Jewish people most interesting. Let's go on to the next slide. Other terms to watch out for. Instead of writing Gentiles, you can certainly use the term Gentiles, Paul does, but think about it when you do use it, because the term Gentiles is a strange term. It's a very non-specific term, and it's a very much a scriptural term in terms of Paul's letters. It's very much a Paul's letters term, because when you think about it, if you're from, if you were a Roman, Rome was your capital. If you were Greek, maybe you were from Athens or from Corinth or elsewhere. But Gentiles are only defined by being non-Jews. It's not really a specific designation. It's like barbarian. For the Greeks, you were either Greek or Greek formed, which, by the way, did not mean necessarily being from Greece, or you were barbarian. And that barbarian isn't a specific thing. I mean, it doesn't say whether you're from Britain of the day or the Germanic areas. It just meant not Greek. In the same way, Gentile means not Jewish. There's no ethnicity, no capital city, no home country. And in fact, Hebrew scriptures often carry more distinction than this. And so they will distinguish between Scythians and Egyptians and others and people from Arabia. So we always have to be careful with the term Gentile. It certainly is a term that Paul used. But Paul, in fact, sometimes applies it. And oddly enough, very early on in the Jesus movement, Gentiles started to be applied to anyone who is not a Jesus follower. But we'll come back to that later. All right. Other words to be careful for. The term church. Now, the Bible that you're using may well use the term church in talking about Paul's assemblies, but I prefer in general to use the term assembly. And the reason is that when we tend to think of church, we tend to think of church as, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the fingers, and here's all the people. And we think about architecture, and we think about the long history of. All right, I think I'm back. I don't know what that means. Let me share the screen again. And am I recording? Yeah. So I'm just going to keep going. And that is that the term ecclesia or ecclesia was first used in the first century of certain types of synagogues and political meetings. And Paul definitely used that term. But let's use the term assembly, because it shows that the gatherings of Jesus followers happened very often in homes and not in churches. And there was no institution as we think of that institution. Also, Paul, in his day, never ever presumed that there would be a church. And the reason is that he thought that the world as we know it would be coming to an end, and that the day of the Lord would come and the God of Israel would vindicate God's people, the Jews, and that the Christ followers would be following along with that. It would be the end of human history. Another term to be careful of, the term Bible. There was no Bible in the first century. Jesus and his followers, including Paul, did not have a Bible. They had scriptures, which was a large and unformed, it had no fence around it. It was a whole set of scriptures in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, and different people used different of these texts, and they had different, they were used in different ways. But there was no closed collection, what we call a canon of scriptural texts. Certainly the Torah was important, the Nevi'im, the prophets were important, and there were scriptures, but it was not yet a Bible, and it was not yet a closed list. And it certainly wasn't yet a Christian Bible, which took many, many centuries yet to develop. And finally, Messiah, the term Messiah, and the term Jesus Christ that goes with that. The Jews were not expecting the Messiah, as if there was a sort of a job description set out in the prophets like Isaiah, and all the Jews in the first century were waiting around for the Messiah to show up. This is not at all the situation in the first century, and we need to be careful of that. There were many varieties of messianic expectation, and there were many forms of Judaism that were not particularly messianic. You could be a Messiah. Cyrus of Persia was considered a Messiah in the book of Isaiah, in the writings of the prophet Isaiah. The Messiah was expected to be more like a Davidic figure. Those Jews who expected a Messiah or hoped for a Messiah, hoped for a political deliverer who may not have in any way been divine, but simply anointed by God, as many human beings had been, according to Hebrew thought and scriptures. Very, very human beings had been anointed by God to serve a certain purpose. That's anointment. Means Mashiach, means Christ. Christos means Messiah. So reading the post-Jesus definitions of Messiah, of one unique individual who dies and believes to have been risen again, is very much retrojecting an idea of Messiah onto the first century. So all of these terms, church, Bible, conversion, Christian, we have to be very, very careful of. And here's some authors that you can take a look at. Paula Fredrickson wrote an article called Terms That Need Retiring. And there are some other authors given here, that Ziba Crook, Mark Nanos, and many others that you can look at. I hope that this is helpful and helps also set our discussion. Thanks for being with me during this, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.